Hey there, friend. Welcome to this little pocket of peace we call Where Hearts Rest. I want you to know that wherever you've landed to listen to this, whether you're stuck in traffic thinking about everything you need to get done, taking a walk around your neighborhood trying to clear your head, or just curled up somewhere quiet with a cup of coffee, you're exactly where you need to be right now. Let's take a moment together, okay? Just breathe with me for a second. One of those deep breaths that actually reaches all the way down to your toes, the kind that says to every part of you, it's okay to slow down. It's okay to come home to yourself. Let that breath bring you back from wherever your mind has been racing, back to right here, right now, back to the steady rhythm of your own heart. You know, there's this beautiful ancient practice called loving kindness. The Buddha called it metta. And here's the thing, it doesn't start with trying to love the whole world. It starts with something way more radical and, honestly, way more challenging. It starts with being genuinely kind to yourself. Not in a cheesy, self-help kind of way, but in the real, gritty, I'm going to treat myself like someone I actually care about kind of way. Today, we're going to explore this through 5 stories. Think of them as windows into a truth you probably already know but maybe haven't had time to really sit with. That the love and acceptance you've been searching for everywhere else has been quietly waiting inside you all along. We'll meet someone who finds an old mirror in a mountain cave and learns something surprising about how to look at themselves. We'll walk with someone discovering a hidden garden in their own backyard that only blooms when they stop being so hard on themselves. There's a lighthouse keeper who turns their biggest fear into their greatest strength, a weaver creating something beautiful that nobody can see until they learn to appreciate their own company, and a star that almost dims itself, trying to fit in before remembering how to shine authentically. These aren't just nice stories. They're maps to something real, something that exists in that quiet space inside you that's always there, even when life gets loud and complicated and overwhelming. They speak the language your heart knows best, the one that doesn't care about your job title or your age or whether you've got your life figured out. As we dive in, I want you to listen the way you'd listen to a good friend telling you something important over dinner. Don't worry about taking notes or remembering everything. Just let these stories settle in wherever they want to land. Trust that whatever you need to hear will find its way to you. There's something the Buddha said that I love. If your compassion doesn't include yourself, it's incomplete. These next 60 minutes, they're an invitation to complete that circle. To practice the revolutionary act of treating yourself with the same kindness you'd show someone you love who's having a hard time. So get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Maybe let out one of those sighs that releases whatever tension you didn't even know you were carrying. Open up to the possibility that the peace you've been looking for in a million different places might be closer than you think, right there in the gentle space of your own presence. Our first story takes us to a place where silence has something important to say, and where looking in a mirror becomes an act of love. Ready? Let's begin. Picture yourself walking down a path that everyone else seems to avoid. You know the one I'm talking about. We all have those routes in life that call to us from a distance, but we hesitate to take them. Maybe it's the path that leads to quiet, to moments alone with just yourself, the place that many of us fear most. Why are we so scared of being alone with ourselves anyway? Why does the thought of sitting in silence, no phone, no music, no distractions whatsoever, make us feel so uneasy? Is it because we're afraid of what we might see when we finally stop running and really look at who we are? But here's a question that might surprise you. What if solitude isn't the emptiness we imagine it to be? What if instead of being this scary void that needs to be filled, it's actually sacred space waiting for us to discover it? What if in that silence, we don't find the nothingness we're afraid of, but instead find a kind of fullness we never knew existed? Today's story starts with someone asking these exact questions. They're about to discover that sometimes the places we're most afraid to go are the ones holding our greatest gifts. And sometimes, truly looking in the mirror is the bravest thing we can do. You might recognize yourself in this traveler. Maybe you felt that pull towards solitude but talked yourself out of it. Maybe you've avoided quiet moments because they make you uncomfortable. Or maybe you're someone who craves alone time but feels guilty about it, like you should always want to be around people. Wherever you are with this, I want you to know that what we're about to explore together isn't about becoming a hermit or cutting yourself off from the world. It's about discovering that the relationship you have with yourself sets the tone for every other relationship in your life. There was a traveler who had journeyed across the world seeking wisdom. They'd studied with famous teachers, read ancient texts, and engaged in deep conversations with philosophers and spiritual guides. But despite all this accumulated knowledge, something still felt missing, like the most important piece of the puzzle was nowhere to be found. One day, while passing through a remote mountain region, they heard the locals whispering about an ancient cave hidden high on the mountainside. "Nobody goes up there," they murmured. They say anyone who enters that cave has to face themselves in a way they've never had to face before. Instead of fear, the traveler felt curious. After days of difficult climbing, they finally found the cave. The entrance was small and narrow, almost completely hidden behind rocks and overgrown vegetation. As they stepped inside, they noticed an unusual kind of silence, not the empty kind of quiet, but a living silence that seemed to be waiting for something. Deep within the cave, they discovered a small underground pool with water, so still it looked like a perfect mirror. Light from a crack in the cave ceiling filtered down, creating gentle rays that danced across the water's surface. When the traveler bent down to look, they saw their own face reflected in the water. But this wasn't an ordinary reflection. In this pool, they saw not just their physical features, but all the emotions they'd been trying to hide, all the fears they'd been running from, all the parts of themselves they'd refused to acknowledge. At first, the traveler wanted to turn away. The image in the water made them uncomfortable, They saw the loneliness they'd been avoiding, the questions about themselves they'd never dared ask, the aspects of their personality they weren't happy with. But something kept them there. Maybe it was the understanding that they'd come too far to turn back now. Maybe it was the realization that this was exactly the challenge they'd been seeking their whole life. So they sat down beside the pool and began to really look. They sat there, facing themselves in silence. Nothing to hide behind, nothing to distract them, just the pure truth of who they really were. And then something miraculous started to happen. The longer they sat, the longer they looked with kindness instead of judgment, the image in the water began to change. The harsh lines in their face softened. The worried wrinkles transformed into lines of understanding. Eyes that had been filled with fear now shone with compassion. The traveler realized that the water only reflected clearly when they approached it with love, not with fear. They began to understand that all those years of seeking wisdom outside themselves, they'd overlooked the most important source of wisdom, knowing and accepting themselves. In the sacred solitude of the cave, without the noise of the outside world, without other people's opinions, they could finally hear the true voice of their own heart. The pool seemed to whisper ancient truths, that they were enough, exactly as they were. That their struggles and imperfections weren't flaws to be hidden, but parts of their human story to be embraced with tenderness. That the love they'd been seeking everywhere else had been quietly waiting inside them all along. As they continued to sit in that profound silence, they felt layers of self-criticism and doubt beginning to dissolve. For the first time in their life, they weren't trying to be anyone else. They weren't performing or pretending or putting on a brave face. They were simply being, and that being felt like coming home. When they finally stood to leave the cave, they felt like a completely different person. Not because they'd become someone else, but because for the first time, they'd truly become themselves. They'd learned that solitude wasn't a punishment but a gift, and that the mirror in the mountain cave had taught them that love begins with seeing yourself through kind eyes. Walking back down the mountain, they carried with them a new understanding, that the peace they'd been searching for in 1,000 places had been waiting in the most intimate place of all, in their own gentle, accepting presence. The story of the mirror in the mountain cave reflects one of Buddhism's core teachings about the power of sacred solitude. The Buddha called this viveka, the separation from the outer world to understand the inner world. Before the Buddha achieved enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, he spent years in retreat, not to escape the world, but to understand the true nature of existence. He realized that to bring happiness to all beings, he first had to find happiness and peace within himself. In Buddhist tradition, viveka is considered one of the 3 foundations of true happiness. It doesn't mean becoming a hermit or cutting off all social relationships. Instead, Viveka is the ability to create sacred space within our daily lives, moments when we can return to ourselves without needing validation from outside sources. The mirror in our story represents metta, loving kindness, directed toward ourselves. When the traveler learned to look at themselves with gentle eyes instead of judgment, the mirror reflected truth clearly and beautifully. This is the practice of self-metta, the prerequisite for all other forms of love. The Buddha taught, "Attahiyatano natho," you are your own refuge. This doesn't mean we should be isolated or self-reliant in an unhealthy way. It means we need to learn to become our own best friend. When we're no longer afraid of being alone, we discover that we were never truly alone to begin with. What's revolutionary about this teaching is that it flips our usual understanding of solitude. Instead of seeing alone time as something to endure or fill up with distractions, we begin to see it as sacred space for self-discovery and healing. In today's world, where constant distraction has become the norm, seeking moments of viveka becomes a radical act. It's saying no to the noise outside so we can hear the wisdom inside. The Buddha's insight was that external peace is impossible without inner peace. When we learn to be genuinely kind to ourselves in solitude, that kindness naturally flows into all our relationships. We stop looking to others to complete us because we've learned to feel whole on our own. This isn't about selfishness. It's about sustainability. When we're running on empty inside, we have nothing authentic to offer others. But when we've learned to fill our own cup with self-compassion, we can share from our overflow rather than our emptiness. When was the last time you sat alone, really alone, without your phone, without music, without anything to fill the space? When was the last time you looked in an actual mirror and instead of finding flaws, you tried to say something kind to yourself? Today, I want to invite you to try something simple. Set aside just 5 minutes, just 5, to sit quietly with yourself. You don't need to meditate in any complicated way. Just sit and breathe. If your mind starts judging or worrying, remember the traveler in the cave. Look at those thoughts with gentleness, like you're gazing into that clear pool of water. Remember that solitude isn't emptiness, it's fullness. It's not punishment, it's a gift you give yourself. Like the traveler learned, sometimes we have to go alone to truly find ourselves. Start small. Maybe it's 5 minutes of quiet with your morning coffee. Maybe it's sitting in your car for a moment before you go into work. Maybe it's taking a walk without podcasts or music, just you and your thoughts. And when you learn to love what you see reflected back at you, you'll discover something beautiful waiting in our next story. There's a garden that exists within each of us that only we can tend. I know that might sound a little abstract, but stay with me for a moment. Think about how much energy you spend looking outward, checking how others see you, measuring yourself against people on social media, seeking approval and validation from the world around you. We become experts at reading other people's expressions, anticipating their needs, trying to figure out what they want from us. But when was the last time you turned that same careful attention inward? When did you last pause to really notice what's growing in your own inner landscape? Here's what I've noticed. We live in a culture that teaches us to be external gardeners. We're encouraged to cultivate our image, our reputation, our online presence. We learn to tend everyone else's feelings while completely neglecting our own emotional ecosystem. We know more about our friends' daily moods than we do about the subtle shifts happening in our own hearts. But what if I told you that there's a whole world blooming inside you that you might have never fully explored? What if the very thing you've been seeking in all those external places, that sense of being truly known and understood, is actually waiting for you to discover it within yourself? Today's story is about someone who stumbles upon their own inner garden and what they learn about the art of turning toward themselves with the same curiosity and care they'd show a beloved friend. It's about discovering that self-knowledge isn't selfish, it's essential. And it's about learning that the relationship you have with your own heart sets the foundation for every other relationship in your life. Maybe you're someone who's afraid to look too closely at your inner world. Maybe you worry about what you'll find there. Or maybe you're someone who's been so busy taking care of everyone else that you've forgotten you have an inner landscape that needs tending too. There was someone who had spent their whole life being incredibly attentive to the world around them. They were the kind of person others turned to for comfort, advice, and understanding. They had a gift for seeing what people needed and knowing just what to say. Everyone considered them wise and compassionate. But there was something they'd never really noticed. Right behind their house, accessible through a door they walked past every single day, was a garden that had been waiting for them their entire life. One evening, feeling unusually restless, they decided to explore a part of their home they'd somehow never paid attention to. They opened that familiar door they'd passed countless times and stepped outside to find something extraordinary, a garden that seemed to shimmer with possibility, but was completely overgrown and wild. As they walked deeper into this space, something strange began to happen. The garden seemed to shift and change based on their inner state. When they felt anxious, thorny vines appeared along the pathways. When they felt sad, wilted flowers drooped their heads. When they felt angry, red-hot plants with sharp edges sprouted from the soil. At first, this was deeply unsettling. They wanted to retreat back into the house, back to the familiar territory of focusing on everyone else's needs. But something kept drawing them back to this mysterious space, a sense that this garden held secrets they needed to understand. Slowly they began to realize what they were looking at. This was the landscape of their own heart, reflecting back every emotion they'd been too busy to notice, every feeling they'd pushed aside while taking care of others, every part of themselves they'd never taken time to acknowledge. The garden was wild because it had been neglected, not because it was bad or wrong. Those thorny areas weren't enemies to be destroyed. They were simply parts of their inner world that needed gentle attention and care. So they started visiting the garden every day. At first, they didn't try to change anything. They just walked around, noticing what was there. They observed how different areas of the garden responded to different thoughts and feelings. They began to understand the seasons of their own heart, times when everything felt dormant and grey, and times when new growth burst forth with surprising vitality. Gradually, they learned to approach even the most challenging areas of their inner landscape with curiosity instead of judgment. When they encountered the angry red plants, instead of trying to rip them out, they sat with them and asked, "What are you trying to tell me? What do you need?" When they found patches of deep sadness, areas where nothing seemed to grow, they didn't try to immediately plant happy thoughts there. Instead, they learned to tend those spaces with patient presence, understanding that sometimes the soil of the heart needs to rest and be held before it's ready for new growth. The most beautiful discovery was what happened when they brought loving attention to their garden. The thorny vines didn't disappear, but they began to bloom with unexpected flowers. The wilted areas didn't suddenly burst into color, but they started to show subtle signs of new life. The garden didn't become perfect, but it became vibrant and alive and uniquely theirs. They realized that all those years of being wise and compassionate with others, they'd never learned to extend that same quality of attention to themselves. They'd been like a master gardener who spent all their time cultivating everyone else's land while their own plot remained a mystery to them. But now, as they learned to tend their inner garden with the same care they'd always shown the world, something magical happened. Their capacity to be present with others actually deepened. Because they were no longer afraid of their own emotional landscape, they could sit with other people's difficult feelings without needing to fix or change them. They discovered that self-knowledge wasn't about becoming self-absorbed or narcissistic. It was about developing an intimate, loving relationship with the fullness of who they were, the beautiful parts and the challenging parts, the seasons of growth and the seasons of dormancy. The garden taught them that every emotion, every reaction, every part of their inner world had something valuable to offer when approached with gentle curiosity. They learned that their heart, like any garden, had its own wisdom about what it needed to flourish. This story reflects one of the most fundamental practices in Buddhist wisdom, satipatthana, the 4 foundations of mindfulness. The 3rd foundation specifically focuses on mindfulness of mind, learning to observe our mental and emotional states with clear, loving awareness. The Buddha taught that most of our suffering comes from being unconscious of our own mental patterns. We react to life from old conditioning, without ever pausing to understand what's actually happening in our inner world. It's like trying to garden in the dark. We might be watering the weeds and stepping on the flowers without even knowing it. In our story, the garden represents what Buddhist psychology calls the heart-mind, the interconnected landscape of thoughts, emotions, memories, and reactions that make up our inner experience. The practice of mindful awareness is like bringing a gentle light to this inner territory. The Buddha introduced a beautiful concept called yoniso manasikara, wise attention or skillful consideration. This means learning to look at our inner experience with the same careful, non-judgmental attention a scientist might bring to studying something fascinating in nature. When the gardener in our story learned to approach even the thorny, difficult areas with curiosity instead of resistance, they were practicing this wise attention. In Buddhist understanding, resistance to our experience creates suffering, while acceptance and gentle investigation create the conditions for transformation. There's a traditional meditation instruction that says, "Whatever arises in the mind, greet it like a welcome guest." This doesn't mean we have to like every thought or emotion, but we can learn to meet our inner experience with the same hospitality we'd offer a visitor to our home. The garden metaphor also reflects the Buddhist understanding of impermanence. Just as gardens change with seasons, our inner landscape is constantly shifting. Learning to tend our hearts with mindful awareness helps us flow with these natural changes instead of fighting them. What's particularly beautiful about this teaching is that it leads to what Buddhists call mudita, sympathetic joy, or the ability to celebrate others' happiness. When we're no longer afraid of our own emotional landscape, we can genuinely appreciate the full spectrum of human experience in others. The practice isn't about creating a perfect inner garden any more than external gardening is about controlling nature. It's about learning to work skillfully with what arises, creating conditions for wisdom and compassion to naturally unfold. Take a moment right now to notice what's happening in your inner landscape. Without trying to change anything, just observe what emotions are present. What thoughts are moving through your mind? What does your heart feel like in this moment? You don't need to have answers or insights. You're just beginning the practice of turning toward yourself with gentle curiosity, the way you might notice what's happening in an actual garden. Maybe start small. Once a day, perhaps during your morning coffee or right before bed, check in with your inner garden. Ask yourself, what's growing here today? What needs attention? What's trying to bloom? If you notice difficult emotions, try not to immediately distract yourself or push them away. See if you can sit with them for just a moment, the way our gardener learned to sit with the thorny vines. What might they be trying to tell you? Remember, this isn't about becoming self-obsessed. It's about developing the self-awareness that allows you to show up more authentically in all your relationships. When you know your own heart, you can offer others genuine presence instead of just going through the motions. And as you learn to tend your inner garden with loving awareness, you'll discover something beautiful growing in our next story. Some of us are called to be lighthouse keepers of the soul. You know what I mean? You might be the person your friends turn to when everything falls apart, the one who somehow always knows what to say when the world feels too heavy. Maybe you're the steady presence in your family, the one who holds it together when everyone else is falling apart. But here's what nobody talks about. What happens when the lighthouse keeper faces their own dark night? What happens when the person everyone relies on for light suddenly finds themselves surrounded by the very darkness they've been helping others navigate? There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being the strong one, isn't there? It's the isolation of feeling like you can't show your own vulnerability, like you have to have it all figured out because that's what everyone expects from you. It's the weight of believing that if you let your own light dim for even a moment, everyone counting on you will be lost at sea. Maybe you felt this. Maybe you've stood in your own storm, trying to keep your beacon burning while battling fears and doubts that no one else can see. Maybe you've wondered what would happen if people really knew how scared or uncertain you sometimes feel inside. Here's the thing about fear, and I mean the deep, primal fear of being truly alone with our own darkness. We think it's our enemy, but what if it's actually our greatest teacher? What if the very thing we're most afraid of facing holds the key to a kind of strength we never knew we had? Today's story is about someone who discovers that the light they've been sharing with the world was never dependent on external circumstances. It's about learning that our deepest fears, when met with compassion, become the birthplace of our most authentic power. And it's about understanding that sometimes we have to navigate our own storm before we can truly guide others home. There was a lighthouse keeper who had dedicated their life to guiding ships safely to shore. Night after night, year after year, they climbed the winding stairs to tend the beacon that had never once failed to shine. Sailors from across the region knew they could depend on this light. It was constant, reliable, a source of safety in the unpredictable darkness of the sea. The keeper took pride in this work, but there was something they'd never told anyone. They were terrified of storms. Not the ordinary kind that came and went with predictable rhythm, but the massive, once-in-a-lifetime storms that seemed to swallow the whole world in darkness. One autumn night, the weather reports began warning of exactly that kind of storm. The kind that would test every system, every backup plan, every assumption about what was possible. As the winds began to pick up and the first drops of rain started hitting the lighthouse windows, the keeper felt that familiar knot of fear forming in their stomach. But this time was different. As the storm intensified beyond anything they'd ever experienced, something unprecedented happened. The main electrical system failed. Then the backup generator sputtered and died. One by one, every external source of power went dark, leaving the keeper alone in complete blackness while the most dangerous storm of their lifetime raged outside. In that moment, sitting in the pitch-black lighthouse with the sound of wind howling like something alive and angry, the keeper faced their deepest terror. Not just the fear of the storm, but the fear of being helpless, of failing everyone who depended on them, of being alone with their own inadequacy when it mattered most. All those years of being the reliable one, the one with answers, the one who never wavered, it all crumbled in that moment of absolute darkness. They felt like a fraud who had been found out, like someone who had been pretending to be brave when they were really just lucky enough never to face a real test. But as they sat there in what felt like the darkest moment of their life, something extraordinary began to happen. In the complete absence of external light, they started to notice something they'd never seen before, a gentle, warm glow coming from somewhere inside their own chest. At first, they thought they were imagining it. But as they placed their hand over their heart and really paid attention, they realized this inner light had always been there. It had been shining steadily through every storm they'd ever weathered, every moment of doubt they'd ever faced, every time they'd helped someone else find their way. The revelation hit them like a gentle earthquake. They'd spent all these years thinking the lighthouse was just the building and the electrical systems, but the real lighthouse had always been them. The light that ships had been following home wasn't coming from the machinery. It was coming from their own unwavering commitment to being a beacon of hope. With this understanding, something shifted. They stopped fighting the storm and started listening to it. They stopped trying to fix what was broken and started trusting what had never been broken. They realized that their fear hadn't been a sign of weakness. It had been trying to teach them something about the difference between external power and the inner light that no storm could ever extinguish. Slowly, carefully, they made their way up the lighthouse stairs in the darkness, guided not by artificial light but by this inner radiance they were finally learning to trust. When they reached the top, they did something they'd never done before. Instead of frantically trying to restart the mechanical systems, they simply stood there and let their own light shine. And here's the miraculous thing: that inner light, that steady flame of compassion and courage that had always lived in their heart, somehow began to radiate outward. It wasn't the harsh, electric beam they were used to, but something warmer, more alive, more real. Ships out in the storm began to see it. Not just the light, but the quality of love and presence behind it. It was as if this beacon was saying, "I know you're scared. I know the darkness feels overwhelming. But you're not alone, and you're going to make it through this." When morning came and the storm finally passed, the keeper understood something that would change their life forever. They'd spent years being afraid of their own darkness, but it was only by facing that darkness completely that they'd discovered their true light. The storm hadn't broken them. It had revealed who they really were. From that day forward, their lighthouse burned differently. It still guided ships safely to shore, but now it carried something extra, the deep wisdom that comes from someone who has faced their own night and emerged with authentic compassion for anyone else lost in the dark. This story echoes one of the most profound moments in the Buddha's journey toward enlightenment, his encounter with Mara, the embodiment of fear, doubt, and illusion. On the night before his awakening, as the Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree, Mara appeared with every form of temptation and terror, trying to convince him to abandon his quest for truth. But rather than fighting Mara, or trying to make the fears disappear, the Buddha did something revolutionary. He acknowledged Mara's presence with compassion and invited him to sit down for tea. "I see you, Mara," he said. This act of gentle recognition, rather than resistance, dissolved Mara's power completely. In Buddhist understanding, our fears and doubts aren't enemies to be conquered, but teachers to be welcomed with what's called abhaya, fearlessness born from loving kindness. True fearlessness doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means developing the capacity to meet fear with such profound compassion that it transforms into wisdom. The lighthouse keeper's discovery of their inner light reflects what Buddhists call our Buddha nature, the inherent luminosity of awareness that exists within every being. This light isn't something we need to create or earn. It's something we learn to uncover by removing the layers of fear and conditioning that obscure it. The storm in our story represents what Buddhist psychology calls difficult emotions or challenging life circumstances. The teaching is that these difficulties aren't obstacles to our spiritual growth. They're often the very conditions that reveal our deepest strength and wisdom. There's a beautiful Tibetan Buddhist practice called Tonglen, taking and giving, that perfectly captures the lighthouse keeper's transformation. In this meditation, instead of avoiding pain and grasping for pleasure, we learn to breathe in difficulty with compassion and breathe out relief and peace. We discover that our capacity to be with our own suffering expands our ability to help others with theirs. The Buddha taught that when we stop running from our darkness and learn to meet it with loving awareness, something miraculous happens. The very thing we were afraid of becomes a source of profound compassion for others facing similar struggles. This is why the lighthouse keeper's beacon burned differently after the storm. They'd moved from helping others out of duty or expertise to serving from a place of authentic understanding. They'd learned what the Buddha discovered, that our deepest wounds, when met with love, become our greatest gifts to the world. What's your storm right now? What fear have you been avoiding, thinking that if you really faced it, you wouldn't be strong enough to handle it? Maybe it's the fear of being alone, of not being needed, of people discovering you don't have all the answers you pretend to have. Here's an invitation. Next time you feel that familiar fear rising, try the Buddha's approach with Mara. Instead of fighting it or distracting yourself from it, try saying, "I see you, fear. What are you trying to teach me?" You don't have to like your difficult emotions, but see if you can make space for them the way our lighthouse keeper learned to make space for the storm. Sometimes our biggest breakthroughs come not from avoiding our dark nights, but from discovering what remains unshakable within us when everything external falls away. Start with just 1 minute. Sit with whatever you're feeling without trying to fix it or change it. Notice if there's something steady and warm beneath all the turbulence. That's your inner light, and it's been burning steadily your whole life. And as you learn to trust that unshakable presence within yourself, you'll discover the beautiful secret waiting in our next story. The most important relationship you'll ever have is the one you have with yourself. I know that might sound obvious, but think about it for a moment. You're the one person you'll spend every single moment of your life with. From the time you wake up until you fall asleep, through every triumph and every disappointment, every boring Tuesday and every life-changing moment, you are your own constant companion. Yet how many of us have actually learned to be a good friend to ourselves? How many of us know how to enjoy our own company, how to speak to ourselves with kindness, how to find genuine joy in solitude rather than just tolerating it until someone else comes along? There's something we don't talk about enough, the profound loneliness that comes from being a stranger to yourself. You can be surrounded by people who love you, living a life that looks perfect from the outside, and still feel like something essential is missing. That something is often the simple, revolutionary act of learning to genuinely like who you are when no one else is around. We live in a culture that's terrified of being alone. We fill every silence with podcasts, every empty moment with scrolling, every quiet evening with streaming something. We've become so addicted to external stimulation that we've forgotten how to enjoy the company of our own thoughts, our own imagination, our own heart. But what would change if you truly befriended yourself? What if instead of avoiding alone time, you actually looked forward to it? What if instead of needing constant validation from others, you became your own source of encouragement and understanding? Today's story is about someone who discovers that the art they've been creating their whole life becomes infinitely more beautiful when they learn to appreciate their own company. It's about the magic that happens when we stop looking for someone else to complete us and start enjoying the completeness we already are. There was a weaver who had dedicated their life to creating tapestries of extraordinary beauty. Their work was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer and change depending on how you looked at them, colors that appeared to glow from within the fabric itself. But here's the strange thing. No one else could see what made these tapestries so special. People would look at the weaver's work and see beautiful craftsmanship, sure, but they couldn't see the invisible threads that held everything together, threads that seemed to be made of pure light, threads that connected every element in patterns of stunning complexity and meaning. For years, this caused the weaver enormous pain. They would spend months creating a piece, pouring their heart into every stitch, working with materials that seemed to come from some otherworldly source. But when they shared their work, people would offer polite compliments and move on, clearly missing the magic that the weaver could see so clearly. The weaver began to doubt themselves. Maybe they were imagining things. Maybe these luminous threads they thought they were working with were just a delusion. Maybe their work wasn't special at all. Slowly, they started trying to create tapestries that others would appreciate, using only the threads that everyone else could see, following patterns that were predictable and safe. But the more they tried to create what others wanted, the more lifeless their work became. The invisible threads disappeared entirely, and with them went all the joy the weaver had once found in their craft. They felt like they were betraying some essential part of themselves, but they didn't know how to get back to the magic they'd lost. One day, feeling completely discouraged, the weaver decided to take a break from creating for others and made something just for themselves. They went back to their original materials, including those mysterious luminous threads that nobody else seemed to notice. They worked without any plan, just following their intuition, creating something that pleased their own eye and heart. As they worked, something beautiful began to happen. They found themselves talking to the tapestry as if it were an old friend. "What do you want to become?" they would ask the emerging pattern. "What story are you trying to tell?" They began to enjoy the quiet hours in their studio, the gentle rhythm of their hands moving across the loom, the surprise of watching something beautiful emerge thread by thread. For the first time in years, they weren't lonely while working alone. Instead of feeling like they were waiting for someone to come appreciate their work, they were genuinely enjoying the process of creation itself. They laughed at their own mistakes, celebrated their small victories, and found themselves looking forward to the solitary hours in their studio. The most surprising thing was how they started talking to themselves during these sessions. Not the harsh, critical voice they'd grown used to, but a gentle, encouraging voice, the same tone they'd use with a dear friend who was struggling with a difficult project. "That's beautiful," they'd tell themselves when a particularly lovely pattern emerged. "Don't worry about that knot. We can work with it," when something didn't go as planned. As weeks passed, the weaver noticed something miraculous. The invisible threads were coming back, brighter and more beautiful than ever. But more than that, they were starting to understand what these threads really were. They weren't just part of the tapestry, they were the visible manifestation of the love and appreciation the weaver was finally learning to give themselves. When they worked with self-criticism and doubt, the threads became dull and lifeless. But when they worked with self-compassion and genuine enjoyment of their own company, the threads blazed with light that seemed to come from some infinite source. Then something even more wonderful happened. People began to notice the invisible threads. Not everyone, but those who had learned to see with the eyes of love, they could suddenly perceive the luminous patterns that had always been there. The weaver realized that their art had become a kind of invitation for others to discover their own capacity for seeing beauty that exists beyond the ordinary. But the most important discovery was this: the weaver no longer needed anyone else to see the magic in their work to know it was real. They had become their own appreciative audience, their own encouraging friend, their own gentle critic. They'd learned that the relationship they had with themselves while creating was more important than any external validation. They understood now that those invisible threads had always been threads of self-love, self-acceptance, and genuine enjoyment of their own unique way of seeing the world. When they tried to weave for others' approval, those threads disappeared because they were no longer being true to themselves. But when they returned to creating from authentic self-expression and self-appreciation, the magic became undeniable. This story illuminates one of the most beautiful concepts in Buddhist psychology, Atma Metta, loving kindness directed toward oneself. While many spiritual traditions emphasize love for others, Buddhism recognizes that genuine compassion for others is impossible without first cultivating a loving relationship with ourselves. The invisible threads in our story represent what Tibetan Buddhism calls Rigpa, the luminous awareness that is our true nature. When we approach ourselves with criticism and judgment, this natural radiance becomes obscured. But when we learn to befriend our own experience with gentle acceptance, our innate Buddha nature begins to shine through everything we do. The weaver's transformation reflects the Buddhist practice of kalyana mitra, spiritual friendship. Usually, this term refers to relationships with wise teachers or fellow practitioners, but the deepest form of spiritual friendship is the one we cultivate with ourselves. Learning to be our own kalyana mitra means becoming the encouraging voice that supports our growth, the wise counselor who helps us navigate difficulties, and the compassionate friend who accepts us exactly as we are. There's a beautiful teaching in the Dhammapada where the Buddha says, "Better than 1,000 meaningless words is one word that brings peace." When we learn to speak to ourselves with the same kindness we'd offer a beloved friend, our inner dialogue becomes a source of peace rather than agitation. The weaver's discovery that their art became more beautiful when they enjoyed their own company reflects the Buddhist understanding that everything we create, whether it's art, relationships, or our daily lives, is infused with the quality of consciousness we bring to it. When we approach life from self-criticism and loneliness, that energy permeates everything we touch. But when we learn to work from a place of self-love and genuine contentment with our own presence, that positive energy becomes a gift to the world. Buddhist meditation often begins with solitary practice, not because relationships aren't important, but because the capacity to be present with others grows from the capacity to be present with ourselves. When we're comfortable with our own thoughts, emotions, and inner landscape, we can offer others genuine presence rather than the anxious energy that comes from trying to escape ourselves. The invisible threads becoming visible to others represents how authentic self-love naturally attracts genuine connection. When we stop performing for approval and start expressing from authentic self-acceptance, we tend to attract people who can appreciate our true nature rather than just our external presentations. How do you talk to yourself when no one else is around? Really listen to that inner voice for a moment. Is it the voice of a friend or a critic? When you make a mistake, do you speak to yourself the way you'd speak to someone you care about? Or do you say things you'd never say to another person? Here's a simple practice. For 1 week, try talking to yourself the way our weaver learned to talk to their tapestry. When you're working on something challenging, offer yourself encouragement. When you mess up, speak to yourself with the same gentleness you'd show a friend who was struggling. When you accomplish something, even something small, acknowledge it with genuine appreciation. Notice what happens when you start treating yourself like someone you actually enjoy spending time with. Pay attention to how it feels to approach your own company with curiosity rather than criticism, with friendship rather than judgment. Maybe start with just 10 minutes a day of genuinely enjoying being alone, not filling the time with distractions, but actually appreciating your own thoughts, your own unique way of seeing the world, your own inner landscape. And as you learn to weave these invisible threads of self-friendship into your daily life, you'll discover something radiant waiting in our final story. Among billions of stars, each one has its own unique light. Think about that for a moment. In all the vastness of space, There has never been and will never be another star exactly like any single one shining tonight. Each star has its own particular brightness, its own color, its own way of illuminating the darkness. Yet here we are on Earth, constantly trying to dim our own light to fit in. We look around at what everyone else is doing and think, maybe I should shine more like them. Maybe my natural brightness is too much, or not enough, or the wrong color entirely. Do you ever feel the pressure to be someone other than who you naturally are? Maybe you've been told you're too sensitive, too intense, too quiet, too loud. Maybe you've learned to hide parts of yourself that don't seem to fit the mold of what's expected or accepted. Maybe you've spent so much energy trying to be what others want that you've forgotten what your own authentic light even looks like. There's something heartbreaking about watching someone try to be anyone other than themselves. It's like watching a star try to shine with someone else's light. The result might look okay from a distance, but it lacks the authentic radiance that comes from expressing your true nature. But here's what I've learned. Your uniqueness isn't a flaw to be fixed or a quirk to be hidden. It's actually your greatest gift to the world. The very things about you that feel different, that don't quite fit the standard template, are often the exact qualities the world needs most. Today's final story is about a star that almost lost its light, trying to be like everyone else, and what it discovered when it finally chose to shine authentically. It's about the courage it takes to be yourself in a world that's constantly asking you to be someone else, and the magic that happens when you stop apologizing for who you are and start celebrating it. In a distant corner of the universe, there was a young star that had always felt different from the others in its constellation. While the stars around it shone with a steady, predictable white light, this star pulsed with colors that shifted and changed, sometimes deep amber, sometimes soft rose, sometimes a brilliant silver blue that seemed to contain all the colors of aurora. The other stars in the constellation had formed their pattern millions of years ago, and they took pride in their perfect, unchanging formation. They shone in harmony, each one bright and white and reliable, creating a pattern that space travelers had used for navigation across countless generations. But our star's shifting colors and variable brightness disrupted the constellation's perfect symmetry. The other stars began to whisper among themselves. "Why can't you just shine steadily like the rest of us?" they asked. "Your changing light is confusing to the travelers. They don't know what to expect from our constellation anymore." The young star felt terrible. The last thing it wanted was to cause problems or make others uncomfortable. So it began trying to change itself, working harder than any star should have to work, attempting to suppress its natural color variations and force its light to burn white and steady like everyone else's. Day after day, the star strained against its own nature. It watched the other stars carefully, trying to match their exact brightness, their exact color, their exact rhythm. It was exhausting work, fighting against every instinct, every natural impulse of its being. Slowly, something tragic began to happen. The more the star tried to be like everyone else, the dimmer its light became. The beautiful colors that had once danced through its radiance faded to a dull, grayish glow. The joyful pulsing that had been its signature rhythm became weak and irregular. Other travelers passing through that region of space began to notice that something was wrong with the constellation. Where once there had been a reliable pattern of bright lights, now there seemed to be a gap, a place where the light was so dim it was barely visible. The star was dying, not from age or cosmic forces, but from the effort of trying to be something it was not. One night, feeling weaker than it had ever felt, the star had what humans might call a moment of revelation. It remembered something from its earliest days of existence, the pure joy it had felt when first discovering its unique light, the way its colors had danced with such natural freedom, the delight it had taken in its own distinctive radiance. "What if," the star whispered to itself, "what if I'm not supposed to be like everyone else? What if my differences aren't a mistake, but a gift?" With this thought, something shifted deep in the star's core. Instead of fighting against its nature, it began to surrender to it. Instead of apologizing for its uniqueness, it began to embrace it. The colors that had been suppressed for so long suddenly burst forth with renewed intensity, amber and rose and silver blue swirling together in patterns of breathtaking beauty. The star's light grew brighter than it had ever been, not in spite of its differences, but because of them. The pulsing rhythm that had once seemed problematic now revealed itself as a cosmic heartbeat, a gentle reminder that light itself is alive and ever-changing. Something miraculous began to happen in the constellation. The other stars, witnessing this display of authentic radiance, started to remember their own unique qualities that they had long ago learned to suppress. One star remembered that it had once enjoyed burning slightly warmer than the others. Another recalled that its light had a subtle blue tint that made it special. Inspired by their companion's courage to be authentic, the other stars began to express their own individual characteristics. The constellation became more beautiful than it had ever been, not because each star was identical, but because each one was brilliantly, uniquely itself. The most wonderful discovery was what happened to the space travelers. Instead of being confused by the constellation's new diversity, they were enchanted by it. The varying colors and rhythms created a cosmic symphony that was far more beautiful and memorable than the old uniform pattern had ever been. But more importantly, different types of travelers could now navigate by different stars within the constellation. Some were drawn to the steady white light, others to the pulsing colors, others to the warm amber glow. The constellation had become a cosmic home that could welcome many different kinds of seekers. The young star realized that by trying to be like everyone else, it had almost deprived the universe of its unique gift. But by choosing to shine authentically, it had not only saved its own light, but had inspired an entire constellation to become more beautiful, more diverse, and more welcoming. From that day forward, the star never again apologized for its colors or tried to dim its natural radiance. It had learned that authenticity isn't selfish. It's actually the greatest service you can offer the world. This story embodies one of the most profound teachings in Buddhism, the understanding of our individual Buddha nature, the unique way that each being expresses the universal truth of awakening. While all beings possess this fundamental nature, each person's path to expressing it is entirely their own. The Buddha taught about svabhava, our essential self-nature or own being. This isn't about ego or personality in the conventional sense, but about the authentic way that universal wisdom and compassion flow through each individual. Just as our star discovered, trying to suppress this authentic nature doesn't serve anyone. It actually deprives the world of a unique expression of truth. In the Lotus Sutra, there's a beautiful teaching that says, every being will eventually become a Buddha, but each will do so in their own way, at their own time, expressing enlightenment through their own particular gifts and characteristics. This is radically different from thinking that everyone should follow identical paths or express wisdom in identical ways. The star's initial attempt to conform reflects what Buddhist psychology calls social conditioning, the way we learn to suppress aspects of ourselves that don't match cultural expectations. This conditioning often happens so early and so subtly that we forget we ever had authentic preferences, natural rhythms, or unique ways of being. But Buddhism teaches that this authentic self-expression isn't about ego gratification, it's about dharma, about finding the unique way you're meant to serve the awakening of all beings. When our star finally shone authentically, it didn't become selfish or disruptive. Instead, it became a beacon that inspired others to find their own authentic expression. There's a beautiful Zen saying, "You are perfect as you are, and you could use a little improvement." This seeming paradox captures the essence of spiritual growth. We don't improve ourselves by becoming someone else, but by becoming more authentically ourselves. The constellation's transformation when all the stars embraced their uniqueness reflects the Buddhist vision of awakened community. In this vision, individual authenticity doesn't create chaos or division. It creates a harmony that's far more beautiful and sustainable than forced uniformity. The Buddha's own life exemplifies this teaching. He didn't become enlightened by copying other teachers or following conventional expectations. He found his own way to truth, and in doing so, opened a path that millions of others could follow, while still honoring their own unique journeys. What makes your light different from everyone else's? What aspects of yourself have you learned to dim or hide because they don't seem to fit the expected pattern? Maybe it's your sensitivity, your intensity, your sense of humor, your way of seeing beauty in unexpected places. Take a moment to think about the last time you felt truly yourself, not performing for anyone, not trying to fit in, just being authentically you. What were you doing? How did it feel? What qualities were you expressing that felt most natural and true? Here's an invitation. For the next week, try expressing one authentic aspect of yourself that you normally keep hidden. Maybe it's sharing an opinion you usually keep to yourself, or pursuing an interest that others might find unusual, or simply speaking in your natural voice instead of the one you think people want to hear. Notice what happens when you stop apologizing for who you are and start celebrating it. Pay attention to how it feels to shine your own light instead of trying to reflect someone else's. Remember our star's discovery. Authenticity isn't selfish. It's the greatest gift you can give the world. When you courageously express your true nature, you give others permission to do the same. And so we come to the end of our journey together, though in truth, it's not really an ending at all. It's more like that moment when you return home from a long trip and see your familiar surroundings with completely new eyes. Thank you for walking this contemplative path with me. Thank you for being willing to sit with the mirror in the mountain cave, to tend the garden behind your heart, to weather the storm in your lighthouse, to weave those invisible threads of self-friendship, and to let your star shine with its own authentic light. Over these past 60 minutes, we've discovered something that the Buddha knew 2,500 years ago, that loving kindness truly does begin within. Not because we're selfish or self-centered, but because the love we offer ourselves becomes the foundation for every other form of love we share with the world. You've learned that solitude isn't something to fear, but something to befriend. That the quiet moments you spend with yourself aren't empty time to be filled, but sacred space to be honored. That your own company, when approached with kindness and curiosity, can become your greatest source of strength and wisdom. As you carry these insights back into your daily life, remember that this practice isn't about perfection. Some days, you'll remember to speak to yourself like a dear friend. Other days, you might slip back into old patterns of self-criticism. That's not failure, that's just being human. The path of loving kindness is walked one gentle step at a time. Maybe you'll find 5 minutes tomorrow morning to sit quietly with yourself, like the traveler in the cave. Maybe you'll check in with your inner garden while having your coffee. Maybe you'll remember, in a moment of difficulty, that you have your own lighthouse burning steadily within. Maybe you'll catch yourself being authentically you and celebrate it, instead of apologizing for it. If these stories have touched something in your heart, I invite you to share that gift. Subscribe to Where Hearts Rest, so we can continue growing this community of people learning to be gentle with themselves. Leave a comment about your own moments of sacred solitude. Your experiences might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And ring that notification bell to be reminded when hearts gather here again. But most importantly, remember this: you are not walking this path alone. Everywhere around you are people learning the same lessons, discovering their own inner gardens, tending their own lighthouse, weaving their own invisible threads of self-compassion. In your quiet moments of self-kindness, you're part of a vast, gentle revolution of hearts learning to come home to themselves. In the Buddhist tradition, we end by sharing the merit of our practice with all beings. So let us dedicate whatever wisdom and peace we've touched today to every person who feels alone, everyone who struggles to be kind to themselves, everyone still searching for the love they already carry within. May all beings be happy. May all beings find peace. May all beings discover the gentle joy of loving kindness that begins within and flows without end. Until hearts rest here again, be gentle with yourself, dear friend. You are so much more loved than you know, especially by the one person whose opinion matters most, you.